impact of that, and who is giving the money to all of this to fund the insurgency? Is it Syria or whatever, or who's behind the training these suicide bombers? And do you think if what the Democratic Party wants, if we just leave, that the suicide bombing will stop, that things will be okay? Because I feel like we should send copies of The Mouse That Roared to everybody in Iraq, because we may have hubris, but we are well-meaning, and we would really want to get that country on the road to democracy.
Well, there's quite a lot of questions there. Muqtada wants a centralized state, doesn't want Iraq broken up. A lot of his rivals do want it turned into a federal country. But one should also say Iraq is so divided by the bloodletting of the last 5 years. It'll be difficult to do. In Baghdad, you know, you have Sunni area, Shia area. It's mostly a Shia city these days. And they don't really meet. There's still 2 million people out who fled Iraq and Syria and Jordan. And by the way, going back to an earlier point, people who say things are so much better in Iraq, I've always thought the real barometer is not what reporters like me say, but what these 2 million people who fled, do they come back or not? Because they're living off in desperate circumstances, and if they feel it's too dangerous, and they do, that shows you what it's really like. Then Maliki went to Iran. Yes, that's another. It's important to understand this. As soon as, I think 2 things were going to happen when the US overthrew Saddam. One, as I mentioned earlier, the Shia were going to take over, and secondly, Iran was going to get more important, become more influential in Iraq. Why? Because Saddam was their great enemy. He was Sunni. They're Shia. They were going to get more influential. And of course, they were also very frightened when President Bush said, you know, spoke of the axis of evil, and they thought Iraq is going to be a sort of aircraft carrier, a land-based aircraft carrier, if you could have such a thing, against Iran. So they think we much better prefer to fight in the streets of Baghdad than in Tehran. The insurgency, who funds it? A lot of money from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. I mean, the Sunni fund this. Muqtada's people, private money, don't have anything like the amount of money. You get money from sort of control of gas stations and so forth. There's various sort of businesses there. Probably a bit from the Iranians, but not so much. So there is money coming in. But it's not just money. I mean, you need a lot more. I mean, even if you didn't have these funds, you'd still have war. There was a 4th question, which I can't quite recall.
What's his end game? Iran? How does he get his money? The insurgency money? Well, with regard to his money, you tell a story about when the looting happened after Baghdad fell. Yeah. That Muqtada did not necessarily disagree with the looting.
Sure. I mean, it was actually not that different from what Secretary Rumsfeld said at the time, which was that it was kind of stuff happens, and.
But he asked for a commission.
Yeah, they suddenly did, which was deeply resented in Iraq, and he sort of rather tried to move away from, was to say it was okay for poor people to take this, but they had to pay arms afterwards. And a lot of Iraqis then thought this is giving a thumbs up to looting. But the looting was, it would have been very difficult to stop. You know, I've been in previous wars. In 1991, there was mass looting. I was in Kurdistan in 1996 when there was, the Kurds were having a civil war. I remember in one city, 5,000 cars disappeared in one day. You know, I was in Mosul the day that fell in 2003. Incredible, just everything being stripped. And it's very difficult to stop. And what should have happened, of course, people should have realized that it was going to happen and declared a curfew. It's the only way you can stop that sort of thing.
Memphis, good morning. You're on with Patrick Cockburn.
Good morning. I will buy your book, and I appreciate you being on. I want to access your intelligence and your journalistic experience. In light of the fact that we are now in the throes of the election, could you just tell the average citizen in America, Bush said we were going over there to fight for democracy. What have we done? What have we accomplished? What can we possibly accomplish considering all these disparate groups that are fighting against one another, and it is religious-based. They want an Islamic government. Who are we to go over there and do what we have done? Secondly, could you talk something about the bases that have been built over there and all the money that's being spent? I think they built a huge embassy for the United States. But you've seen those things, so could you speak to that?
Sure, I'd take the bases, which is actually very relevant at the moment. This very morning, as I was saying, that the Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki said he won't sign an agreement with the U.S. because it reduces Iraq's independence. The heart of this is the question of the bases. The U.S. wants 58 bases in Iraq, of which, and currently there are about 30 big bases there. The others are kind of smaller, forward operating bases, not quite so important. Now, the U.S. position, I read an article about this last week saying there's enormous resentment against this in Iraq. The following morning, Ryan Crocker sort of mentioned this article. He's here in Washington, the U.S. ambassador to Baghdad, denounced it and said, no, it's completely untrue, we want permanent bases. But this is kind of a play on words because according to the Iraqi negotiators, say the U.S. is saying, well, okay, if we have a U.S., big U.S. facility, hundreds, thousands of U.S. troops, we have one Iraqi soldier outside, that somehow the Iraqis are providing security. So it's not really a U.S. base. But you know, if the U.S. has these bases, then it basically is in control of Iraq, and that's deeply resented. And this feeds into your other question about democracy. It's very difficult for an outside power. You know, democracy isn't a word, it's about who has power in a country. Do the people of that country have power to somebody else? If the U.S. has bases there, has immunity for its troops, has immunity for its contractors, there are more contractors paid by the U.S. in Iraq now than U.S. soldiers. If it has control of airspace, if it's allowed to carry out arrests in Iraq or military operations without telling the government, how much is left of Iraqi sovereignty? And how much is left of democracy? If you have democracy without power, people go and vote, then they discover it doesn't have any influence, then you just end up discrediting democracy. You can have a parliament and a prime minister and everything else, but it has to mean something in a real possession of power by the people.
Next call for Patrick Cockburn, Uniontown, Pennsylvania.
Hi.
Hi.
I visit the Counterpunch website as often as possible. It's a very informative website. One piece of information I can't seem to find anywhere, though, is since the U.S. now occupies Iraq, is the U.S. an ersatz member of OPEC? Thank you.
Well, you know, it has some influence over Iraqi oil, but that's fairly limited. I know Shahrastani, the Iraqi oil minister, a very tough guy, spent 10 years in jail under Saddam, was tortured, escaped from jail. These guys aren't going to roll over. The one thing Iraqis do object to is that the Iraqi oil revenues are kept in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And last year, the Iraqis wanted to have this. The dollar was going down. They said, we want to have euros, some other currencies. The U.S. Treasury here in Washington said, you know, that would be a real bad signal. So Iraqis were complaining to me a couple of weeks ago, said that cost us $5 billion. So there's influence over what the Iraqi government does, but not really control of oil and not really control of policy. So I don't think it's quite true to say the U.S. is an ersatz member of OPEC.
When do you go back, and will this book be available there, and will it get you in any trouble?
That's something I spent quite a lot of time thinking about. I sent copies of books to various people there saying, look, I don't want to make too many enemies over this. And if I do, I kind of like to know who they are. It's going to be translated into Arabic. I think that the most dangerous thing there is you write a book in English. This happened to me before, and you want to get it translated by a good company pretty soon, because otherwise pirated editions in Arabic will appear. I did a book a few years ago about Saddam.